Great. Well, we're ready when you are.
Yeah.
Tim, we've made the big part. We're on YouTube.
Yeah, it's supposed that the staff will tell us when the I think, well, now we are on live.
Yes, we are live. I'm looking at the page of the Congress and the YouTube channel, so we can start. Let me make a little introduction in Spanish, and then we will pass in English in order to begin the exposition of the investigation. Hola, buenos días a todos los que nos siguen desde el canal 7 del YouTube del Congreso Internacional número 32 de la Sociedad Mexicana de Estudios Electorales. Esta mañana vamos a presentar el volumen The New Party Challenge, Changing Cycles of Party Birth and Death in Central Europe and Beyond, publicado en el año pasado por la Oxford University Press, con la presencia de, aquí tenemos los dos autores de la obra, tanto el doctor Kevin Deegan Krause como el doctor Tim Houghton. Y el doctor Kevin Deegan nos va a hacer una exposición de la obra. La exposición va a ser en inglés. De todas maneras, pues estamos aquí a la atención de las inquietudes que puedan venir desde la audiencia en los comentarios que se hagan en la transmisión en vivo de YouTube. Va a haber una primera exposición del profesor Krause, Deegan Krause, luego los comentarios del doctor Víctor Alarcón Holguín, y luego tenemos una hora de tiempo. A la medida de lo posible vamos también a dejar el espacio para algunas preguntas que vengan desde el público. Good morning, Professor Deegan, and welcome to the 32nd International Congress of the Mexican Society of Electoral Studies. It's an honor to have the opportunity to listen to a presentation of this book that you wrote with the Professor Tim Houghton. I also appreciate that Professor Houghton is here with us in this event. And the idea is that today conference, you can present your investigation, more or less like 20, 25 minutes. Then the Professor Alarcón will comment on the book. And if it will be possible, we will receive some questions from the audience that is seeing this presentation in the YouTube channel of the Congress. So I will make a little presentation of the Professor Deegan Krause. Kevin Deegan Krause is Professor of Political Science at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. He received a BA in Economics from the Georgetown University in 1990 and a PhD in Government and International Studies from the University of Notre Dame in the year 2000. His research focuses on political parties and democracy in Europe, with emphasis in Europe's newest democracies and its newest party. His newest book, co-authored with Professor Tim Houghton of the University of Birmingham, is The New Party Challenge, Changing Cycles of Party Birth, Death in Central Europe and Beyond. And we are here to listen about this book. So, Professor Deegan, I pass you the microphone and we are going to listen. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I want to thank everyone. I want to apologize that my language skills are those of a Central Europeanist and not of a Latin Americanist. So, but my next generation, my daughter's Spanish is quite good. And so hopefully the baton is passed in a broader global sense, but not my generation, or at least not specifically me. So thank you for letting me do this in English. And I want to thank you for making this possible. My co-author Tim and I, and thank you for Tim for being here despite a busy academic day. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this book. We regard this as a learning process and always to understand new cases and new places. And so to be able to talk to your membership is really, it's a blessing for us. It's really a gift. So let me begin by actually talking a little bit about the book, and actually beginning by reading from the book, because we begin the book with a little bit of a fairy tale. And so actually literally chapter 1 of the book begins with the words "once upon a time." So we start by saying this: once upon a time, there was a king who created a new political party, which he named after himself. He promised to clean up the country's politics. He won more votes than anyone else, and he became prime minister. But politics did not get much cleaner, and he didn't win as many votes the next time. And in fact, almost no one lived happily ever after in this story, except his bodyguard, who created his own new political party, promised to clean up the country's politics, won a lot of votes, and became prime minister. And then in the book, because we're long-winded, we go on and on. So we talk about other figures, the game show host, and the supermarket chain manager, and the comedian, all of whom formed their own political parties, which emerged onto the scene, promised to clean up the country, and died. And this is just a tiny fraction. These are the most interesting in some ways of the people. But this is just a tiny fraction of the number of political parties in Central Europe that have followed that same trajectory. And so as someone who studies Poland and the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Slovenia, and other countries in the region, we couldn't help but notice a pattern. And so our goal over the last 10 years has been to dive in deeply into this pattern and to try and understand it. And we've been rewarded by meeting lots of wonderful colleagues, having great discussions, and also rewarded by the fact that maybe only for us and not for the region, the pattern that we started discovering continues to be true. So after we finished the book, there was yet another figure, in this case, back to Bulgaria, and a talk show host and rock star who also founded a new political party, which burst onto the country's scene. Bulgaria is now in its third election in 1 year, and now even this party is fading in the face of yet another new party. So this is the pattern that we're seeing. And we're really curious to find out to what extent does the pattern that we're finding also apply in Mexico. So I'm going to go rather quickly through the book and just present our basic findings, and then hopefully we can have this discussion. We called the book The New Party Challenge for 3 reasons. And the first is to talk about the challenge that new parties pose to other parties in the system. So new parties emerge, they threaten older parties, sometimes they displace them completely. We also talk about the challenge that new parties actually face, because while they're often very good at displacing old parties, they're often not very good at staying alive themselves. And then there's a third challenge that actually affects every party in the system, which is how to adapt to new technologies, new changing systems of finance and new ways of conceptualizing our political identity. So these are the challenges that the book really deals with. Our big conclusion is that new parties emerge. They often die very quickly, but the species of new parties continue. So once new parties get introduced into a system, you often find a constant cycle of new parties replaced by even newer parties, and then yet newer parties. So new parties die, but the species remains. And we argue that newness is in a way endogenous, that newness generates itself. There are other factors for the newness, but once newness gets going in a system, it's actually very hard to remove from the system. Systems don't settle down. Our methods were really quite concrete. Both Tim and I love to walk around cities and visit political party offices. And we spent years visiting hundreds of political party offices in Central and Eastern Europe. But we also did quite a bit of data gathering at the macro level, both public opinion polls and election results. And we even engaged in a variety of simulations. Thanks to some Central European colleagues. And so we tried to use multiple different methods to talk about the patterns that we found. And what I simply want to do is to go through the argument that we make in the book. And I want to start with the first question of what's new. And in talking to Victor, it seems like this is actually a question that faces the entire region. When we're talking about these kinds of questions, when we write books about what is a new party, it's not as obvious as it should seem. Excuse me a second. And so we were really influenced by a variety of colleagues in here, Gideon and Rahat, Alan Sik, and especially Emanuela and Chiaramonte, who in Party Politics wrote a really kind of important piece about thinking about newness, in their case in Western Europe. In our case, we tried to adapt it to Eastern Europe. And they actually did a really kind of very precise, very specific analysis of what different authors regarded as new. And they found a wide range of different levels of newness. And so you can imagine if there's disagreement even about what constitutes new, then if we're going to make any claims about new parties, we actually need to nail down the newness and to try and be as precise as possible. So Emanuela and Chiaramonte do that. And we try to take it one step further to provide a broader system of deciding what's new. But rather than doing what the other systematizers have done, we actually decided to begin in a different place. Rather than starting by saying, is this party new or is this party old? We actually started by saying, has this party changed a lot or has it changed not very much? So we actually assessed every single political party in the region in every election to see how much it had changed. This is, I think, 360 some parties, how much it had changed from the previous period. And we did that with 4 different categories, which we called inception, transformation, alteration, and continuation. And inception really, in this case, means a complete birth of a party from scratch, a completely new entity. Transformation means the change of a political party from one form into another form that is recognizable, but still substantially different. Alteration means changes within the existing structure of the party. And continuation, really talking about those parties that change very little from election to election. And then even within these, we recognized there were sort of intermediate categories between these. So we ended up with a kind of 7-level ladder, really 0 through 3, with half levels, half steps in between each of these. So we decided, we assessed how much parties had changed, and then we decided, is this new or not? And so what we actually did was to create a sliding scale and ran all of our analyses at every single level of newness. So what if we defined newness as only inception, like Alan Sik, our Estonian colleague, does? That would mean a certain set of parties, but not others. So we can run the data using only that. But we might also want to include parties that have transformed, not simply genuinely new parties, but parties that have made a major fundamental internal change. We can even go down and look at parties that have changed in some less than fundamental way, but in a significant way, and so on. So we can look at all of those various levels. And so what we did when we ran our quantitative analyses was to look at every single level and to see if we see those same patterns. And the really important thing about this is that it means that our results are not dependent on a single level of newness. So we wanted to make sure that the results were robust. They would degrade easily depending on which level, so that we wouldn't have a fight over what's new and what's not new. We could actually have a conversation over what the effects of newness are. In particular, when we did this, we found the biggest controversies you might expect are not in the completely new or the completely continuous, the inception or the continuation, but really in what constitutes transformation or alteration. And as you can imagine, really the big questions are questions of fission and fusion. So fission means really splits, splinters, a lot of different words. We went back to the original physics for this, of 2 things coming apart, and then fusion, two things going together. So we tried to use these new categories and then to assess whether parties were new or not based on these. And for different kinds of fission and fusion, we actually came to different kinds of conclusions. So for example, if a fusion is between a very large party and a very small party, it really ends up not being very different from the original large party. So we would call that more of an alteration. Whereas if a fission is between 2 roughly equal parties, we might consider that more of a transformation, because the parties have to deal with one another and make that accommodation. In the same way, in fission, if a party splits and it's much smaller than the original party, it has to make fundamental changes. And so we would tend to include that party as transformed, whereas the larger part of the party that may even continue holding the original party's name, that party we would tend to consider more of an alteration. So we come up with certain standards. Those are in the book, and we can talk more about those in the Q&A. But we want to set a kind of methodological basis for them, the analysis that we do. And the analysis that we do really depends on every individual party system. And so in order to begin this, we made maps of political party systems and how those political parties changed over time. And this is my own home country. And you can see it's not a very interesting map. Over time, the party vote share has altered slightly between Republicans and Democrats, but not a lot. And so at a certain level, this really isn't a very strong candidate, obviously, for talking about new political parties. It's been a long time since we had one in the United States that was significant. But the further you go from that American model, the more interesting it gets. So the UK example, for example, still relatively high continuity. So Tim's home case, but we still see significant changes. And actually, if you look inside the Northern Irish party system, you see substantial changes, fissions and fusions, and other kinds of change, new parties emerging. And then if you look in the country, there we go, the maps get increasingly complicated. So Slovakia, the area that Tim and I both did our initial research, proves extremely complicated over time, with parties emerging and then disappearing, sometimes emerging, becoming large, and then becoming small again. And we see this kind of pattern throughout the region. So countries like Slovenia, countries like Lithuania, and in some ways, the poster child, the one we began with, the question of the king of Bulgaria, the question of Bulgaria. And you can see here that the Bulgarian system is remarkably complicated, and this doesn't even include the most recent election and the one that's coming up in November. And so when I talked about the king founding his own party, this is the king's new party, and you can see that within 2 election cycles, that party was dead. His bodyguard founded a party here, and within it, party survived a little longer, but it too is suffering considerably. And then all of the other things that are not part of a linear line on this chart represent some kind of change that we talked about. So, for example, new party births, this represents all of the new parties born in Bulgaria with more than 1% of the vote. Some of those were fissions and fusions, so what we would call mergers, splits, splinters. Some of them were inceptions, so from new. Some of them were very large inceptions, like the King's Party and the Bodyguards Party and the rock musician talk show hosts party. And so what we did for every single country was to map these. And it would be lovely if anyone's interested out there. I would love to work with you. We have the infrastructure now to develop a similar map for other countries. So we've developed them for Chile. We're working on Italy, which is quite complicated. I would love to work on one with someone on Mexico. So let us know if you're interested in that. But we have all of these various things, and then we would see party deaths as well. So different kinds of ways that parties leave the political scene. But we realized that this map really tells a discursive story, and what we then needed to do was to actually, in a certain way, map not just the births and deaths, but map the sizes of those parties over time. And so we then developed a series of maps where we looked at political parties and divided the political parties into cohorts depending on when they were born. So we have a 30-year post-communist period. We divided that into 6 5-year periods, and we assigned political parties a cohort depending on when they were born, in which 5-year period when they were born. And then we measured the support for those political parties during every subsequent time period. And what we found almost across the board was that parties began and then they lost support and they were replaced by newer political parties. And so every time political parties declined, so every cohort of political parties declined in every single time period. And so you can see them sort of being squeezed. It's almost like a map of geological time as newer parties land upon old parties and push them down. And we found in an amazing bit of data, and if we had generated the data, if we had produced it artificially, we couldn't have hoped for better data. What we found is that every single cohort declined in every single time period. So that parties get weaker, they don't expand, they don't get larger, parties get weaker over time and they're replaced by newer parties. And the replacement cohorts always started at between 12 and 20%. So every given new time period, new parties represent about 1/5 of the total vote. And we found that the same pattern was actually true in virtually every country in the region. And so maybe there was a slight difference between Poland's and Romania's, but the same overall pattern seemed to endure. We then use these numbers to calculate actually an average weighted party age. So how old is the overall party system? And that's the age of the party times the share that the party has within a given election. And what we found was that party systems did not age as much as time. So this would be the timeline. If a party system were to get as old, if the parties were all to be continuous, like the American system, the line would look something like this. But most Central and Eastern European party systems became older less fast. They found a kind of fountain of youth because of the influx of new political parties. And again, we found this, and the slide isn't showing up, but we found this in every single political party system in the region, that the party systems are younger than the actual age of the democracy overall. So why is this happening? And here I want to just go through some broad explanatory issues, and then I want to wrap up. what we found was that there were really three factors that seemed to explain the difference between old and new parties, and three factors that seemed to explain party death. So we looked very closely at party organization. We looked at the issues that parties argued for, the issue positions that they took, and we looked at party leadership. And what we found was a fundamental difference between the older parties in the system, which tended to have very strong on-the-ground organization. They tended to talk about issues with kind of a durable ability to attract voters, so economic issues and cultural issues. And they tended to have leadership that would have succession, so one leader would replace another within the party. Whereas the newer parties almost exclusively had very light organization on the ground. They were focused not on economic and cultural questions, but questions like corruption that are very hard to sustain, and that their leaderships often tended to be very fixed. They had the same leader for the entirety of their existence. And in this, I have to say, we found significant help really from the literature on political parties in Latin America. And there isn't enough conversation between European and Latin American scholars of parties, and we're glad to be part of this kind of renewed conversation, because the best literature in the world on party survival really is in the Latin American literature. And so we found that there was a fundamental difference, and we found that newer parties almost exclusively, older parties almost exclusively had those characteristics which tended to be related to party endurance, whereas new parties actually had characteristics that tended to be related with rapid death. So not only were newer parties different, newer parties were different systematically in a way that led to their quick demise. And so light organization had a very strong correlation with rapid party death, as did corruption issues and similar questions, as opposed to economic ones. And leadership tends also, not exclusively, but leadership can also lead to a rapid party death. Leadership can be very good for parties at the very beginning, one strong leader, but once that leader outlives his usefulness, the ability of a party to get rid of a leader is crucial, or the party may sink with the leader. And that doesn't tend to happen with the older parties. And we also found that some new parties, very few, including the Bodyguards Party and a party in our own country of Slovakia, actually learned how to behave like older parties. But that this was very few, that very few new parties actually developed the skills of older parties, and therefore very few new parties actually survived. The last big trend that we found was that it's necessary to look at party systems not just on the basis of individual parties, and not just on the basis of outside factors, but that actually there is a kind of internal continuity. So in other words, as I mentioned at the beginning, new parties tend to generate even newer parties. Newness generates more newness. And so we found very early on that in addition to normal left, right, and cultural spectrums, in many of the countries we studied, there was a clean and corrupt issue dimension. But we found that issue dimension was far less stable, because parties would emerge clean, and then over time they would become corrupt, and leaving the space open for yet another new clean party, which would itself become at least perceived as corrupt. And so there was constant movement on that particular axis. And so we found that this was an almost like a relay race, that new parties would sort of hand the baton, not willingly, on to even newer parties. Now, this is very different from what we found about newer parties in the past. So the past work on new parties in Western Europe found two kinds of new parties. One, new parties that emerged and then disappeared and didn't really change the party system. So one example is the Swedish New Democrats from the 1980s, or new parties that emerged and then managed to sustain themselves and continue on in perpetuity. And so the D66 party in the Netherlands is a good example of this, or excuse me, in Denmark, Netherlands, I'm sorry. But what we found was that in Central and Eastern Europe, there tended to be continuous waves of new political parties. So new parties would be replaced by newer parties and yet newer ones, like we found in Slovenia, but also really every other country in the region. And we actually found that this wasn't just new parties, but that voters would actually move from one party to the next new party. They would get disillusioned with that and move to yet another new party. And we found that across the board in Slovenia and in the Czech Republic and in Slovakia and in a whole variety of places. So voters are moving from new to newer to even newer parties. And our question, and this is the last thing I want to say, is our question is, do we see this elsewhere? So we certainly saw this in the Eastern European countries that we looked at. We found it in quite a few Western European countries, most notably in Italy and Spain and France. but also even in countries like Iceland, where you might expect a little bit more stability. And we also tended to find them across the world as well. So actually, and this is just Iceland, even stable Iceland started to look like a Central and Eastern European party with the flow of voters from new parties to even newer ones. So we found it in those countries, but we also found it really across the world. So we found it in Asia, we found it in Africa, and we found it in quite a few places in Latin America as well. And the more I've looked at in preparation for this, the Mexican party system, the more we see a lot of similar developments. And so I'm very curious, rather than telling you what I think about Mexico, I'm really curious to hear what you think about what we're finding. And so the big question that you might want to ask is this good or bad? And we don't have any pure good or bad decisions. But what we have found is this: new parties are supposed to be good because they're supposed to be responsive, get rid of corruption, re-engage citizens. And I see that, Victor, I'm almost done. What we tend to find is that a lot of the promises of newer parties to remove the corrupt and re-engage and re-energize, that those often don't live out. They don't live up to the promises, because the parties become just as bad as the parties they're replacing. Whereas in terms of responsibility, do these parties actually do what they're supposed to? Do they act in the broader interest of the nation? They often have too short a lifespan to actually succeed. And so what we find is that in the long run, these newer parties undermine long-term relationships, and they even shorten the time horizons within which political party systems think about the future. And in a world where we face long-term challenges of migration, of global warming, we need longer term rather than shorter term time horizons. New parties seem to work against that. So thank you for your indulgence. I'm sorry I went a little bit long, and I'm so eager to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Professor Deegan. It was perfect. It was really interesting and really complete. Thank you so much. Now I introduce the Professor Alarcón, who is going to comment the work. Professor Alarcón holds a BA degree in political science in the UNAM, as a master in government and international studies for the University of Notre Dame, and a PhD in social studies for la UAM Iztapalapa. Since 1997, is senior professor of political science in the Department of Sociology of the aforementioned university. Is a member of the National System of the Researcher of Mexico, SNI, Nivel 2. Former president of the Mexican Society of Electoral Studies between 2012 and 2015. And he currently serves as a member of the board of the Research Group of Political Parties. His areas of interest and publications include the study of political parties, elections in Congress, in Mexico, and in comparative perspective as well. Professor Alarcón, you're welcome, and now you'll listen to your comments. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, dear Andrea, and I'm very grateful that also is along with us Professor Rosa Maria Mirón, who we are the board of this research group on political parties within the Mexican Society for Electoral Studies, and we are very glad of having here you both, dear professors Houghton and Deegan, and I'm very grateful because, well, this is a great opportunity to introduce a very good friend and colleague who is Kevin Deegan to the Mexican audience, and I think that is the best way in doing so. By presenting their wonderful book written along with Tim. My comments are very simple. I will go directly to some piece that I wrote in order to avoid some mistakes by my poor English at this time, because I haven't practiced it since a long time ago. But I will try to encompass some of the comments and some of my ideas by trying to fit with the presentation already made by by Professor Deegan. Well, first of all, this book is a substantial contribution to the knowledge existing about the creation of political parties, supported by a solid data set collection from 11 countries from the Central European region. It provides a fresh approach that allows us to discuss about the future of participative and representative institutions under the situation of both illiberal and populist menaces that is currently defined to establish democracies all over the world. The paradox is that these new political parties and the movements endorsing them emerged during the last 15 years and have adopted a set of anti-establishment postures calling up to the end of corruption and other vices within the traditional elites and their parties. The book starts and ends up with a reference to Slovenia, which includes a lot of the features that the authors find out as a constant for the cases examined in the research. For instance, a population exhausted due to the persistence of former communist structures, despite the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1989, a country exposed to a regional crisis caused by the 1990s Balkan War and desperately attached to the expectations posed by the entrance to the European Union as the only possible solution to cope with the ongoing crisis. A xenophobic anti-immigration and nationalistic and regional rhetoric used as a fuel of anger among voters. But in addition, all these organizations benefited from the presence of strong charismatic leaders that gave them a sense of confidence and direction despite the lack of consistent manifestos and programs to obtain the vote. Hope and deceptions are two ingredients really complicated to coexist, considering the success or failure that usually follow ups to their first electoral participation. The repetition of this process in Central Europe and other areas worldwide gave a good hint to Professor Houghton and Deegan Krause to investigate the presence of common grounds, describes usually in historical terms and much less in theoretical and methodological ones by other colleagues, and they allow us to arrive at a new theory about the challenges that the new political organizations put into the stability of party systems and the quality of democratic regimes as well. The existence of new political parties was not an inception of newcomers and outsiders to politics only. That means entrepreneurs, intellectuals or comedians. They are also derived from the splitting in terms of fissions or fusions that continues, alters, or intends to transform the political landscape. Many of these elements are possible to understand why younger or minority leaders who are unable to ascend or take over the party's control decide to move out. Or in opposition to this situation, these parties become a creation of displaced leaders intending to preserve a substantial level of presence to influence over the next government. This is thus crucial element that the authors point out is that the new parties could be ephemeral, but they are disturbing and capable and disrupting and capable enough to produce long waves and effects of unstable competition precisely due to their novelty across the electorate. And in many cases, they have achieved to be part and to lead the government of their countries. Hence, the authors identified three important sources interacting in the process. intra-country, intra-regional, and inter-regional. That means global trends. Here we can find that the institutional design to the electoral system is an interesting framework to evaluate not only the regional patterns, but also sheds light into the cases individually by making possible to analyze the type of prevailing cleavages, the heritage derived from the past, the impact of accessing into the free market economy, the level of right of left populism, and I would add up the process of realignments and alignments that derives from these party systems. All these variables are recognized by the authors as explanatory and interdependent among them for the launching of new parties. The latter statements derives into three levels of challenge. First, the new party needs to be convincing in its defiance to the establishment. Second, the new party must create a solid story tell about its advantages over the current government. And third, the new party develops the presence of close ties and networks by making use of technology and personal proximity. In addition, the authors explore the role that new political parties do possess to enhance either change or continuity into the party system by determining their capabilities to create and to shape the political agenda, its timing, and its life survival. More specifically, the author explored institutional facts usually seen as constraints to the creation of new parties. For example, the presence of a strong presidential or parliamentary system with stable, legit, and dominant forces. The presence of limits for registration, as well as significant electoral thresholds and restrictions on party financing, are also elements to be considered. The book mentions that inasmuch as they were weak, that increased the possibilities of creating a positive response to those organizations by the electorate and by these political parties themselves. But also, such actions could be associated to critical elements such as the presence of a bad economy performance, the support or refusal to join to the European Union, and another significant contribution is also made by the authors related to differentiate the process of creating a new political party as an unique event in time, and to extend it as a sequence of attempts which makes possible its evolution and transformation into personal or ideological labels in each different election. That is why the idea of party survival is extremely crucial to understand the cycles and cohorts, and in terms of the logic of organization, linkages, and level of performances, both in the legislature and the executive areas, and by having compelling causes and leaders to whom voters can rely upon and feel linked with. Besides, it works out to define how we can measure the level of volatility, not only linked to the electoral change, but in terms of determining the change experience within the social and political system. Another significant element raised by the authors is that strategic choices have a substantial influence on the results a new party achieves over time. The making of interviews to party officials and leaders to get a solid background concerning the explanation of success or failure attained by each party case is an important source to the study. The conclusion is quite relevant. Rooted parties have clear ideological appeals. Rooted parties having clear ideological appeals are more likely to survive than those simply grounded on on personal leadership or supported by entrepreneurs. the analysis of these issues is in the chapters which makes the comparison of the 11 country cases during the period going from 1990 to 2019. Define a four-folded route for voters. They express preferences for the newer subsystem of parties. They can prolong such decision moving from a new to a newer formation until arriving into a stable preference. Unless the voter has a serious deception with newer parties, there is a chance of reversing to support a traditional party back again. So, in this case, I believe that this strong and very useful contribution made and posed by the book, I think that if we took into account the Latin American experiences and more specifically the Mexican experience for the purposes that this book could be useful to understand the mechanics and the recent development of, for instance, a ruling party such as Morena, I think that this book could be a very interesting entrance to all the people who are to all those people who are interested on having a good idea that what a new political party is, why is created, and which are the motivations and which are the constraints that could face a long time with concerning the regulations, the funding, the financing, and many other institutional frameworks that in which these organizations needs to work with. And I think that that's why many of the questions and many of the comments that I'm pretty sure that this book will raise up with the audience. I think that there are going to be with the idea that if a new political party needs to be studied, not due to a simple or a singular election, but within a cycle of several stages and a cycle of several features that we could have in mind in order to understand why this idea of new political party challenge is not only with simple registration, but also with a lot of components, a lot of elements that this book show us that are needed to be studied. And that this will be my comment. Unfortunately, I did it very quickly and very fast, so I hope that at least the bunch of the bulk of the main argument that I wanted to retrieve from the book could be at least more or less exposed, and I think that it's time to give the floor to potential questions that must be addressed to our colleagues and presenters.
Thank you very much, Professor Alarcón, and really interesting observations. And now we are going to read some questions that the audience in the YouTube channel have made. I will read there are 3 questions, so I will read the 3 questions and then I will give the Professor Digan the time to answer the 3 at the same time in order to contest. Well, there is also one question of the Professor Miron.
No, it's not.
So,
it's not a question. I would like to. I would like to suggest that we also hear the reaction of Kevin and Tim on what Victor has just said. I would like to hear your reaction, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor.
To the questions as well, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay. Well, the first question is from Luisa Natalia Jimenez Almeron, who asks, Does the presence of a charismatic leader condemns or foster the success of a new party? The second question is from Esperanza Isabel Palma Cabrera. Greetings, Kevin, from Esperanza Palma. Do electoral rules make any difference to explain the fate of new parties? And the last question from Carolina Stefania Muñoz Canto. Congratulations for the research and the presentation. In the same sense of the first question, I would like to know if any one characteristics of leadership are mediating the new party's survival. Thank you. Professor, we listen to you.
Wow, these are wonderful questions and very gracious questions. It's rare in any American Political Science Association for someone to start with congratulations or kindness in questions. So I'm really very thankful. I want to introduce my co-author Tim, who has not yet had a chance to really have any voice. Tim, I just wanted to see if you wanted to weigh in on any of these in particular, or how do you want to split the difference, so to speak?
I don't mind. I'm very happy. I mean, I can make a few very brief comments on the three, and then if you wanted to elaborate, perhaps.
Perfect.
So, in the spirit. So firstly, muchas gracias and hola. It's buenas tardes where I am rather than good morning. But thank you all for coming. So very quickly, let me answer those questions briefly. The issue of leadership and charisma, it's a double-edged sword. So it can be both a real positive, but a real negative. The problem with that is that if the success of a new party, the appeal of a new party is based a lot around one individual and that individual's charisma, that individual's appeal, it's very risky, because what then happens if something occurs to that particular leader? And one of the things that's probably worth emphasizing is that a lot of the parties that we looked at, where there were prominent leaders, their appeal was to say, I am the person who can rid the country of corruption. I am the person who can lead the country to success. And the problem is when they then get embroiled in corruption scandals, that can be extremely dangerous and damaging for the party. So charisma can be incredibly beneficial, but it can be very dangerous. And the other thing to emphasize about it is the sort of duration of leaders can sometimes be quite a long time. Biology can play a crucial role here. Particular leaders can be around for a very long time indeed. The problem is that the more that the party becomes associated with one individual, the more that it's going to struggle to survive beyond that one individual. And this is why having parties that are more than the leader are likely to endure. So leadership can be very good, and charismatic leadership can be very good in the short term, but it's very damaging in the medium to long term. And very briefly on electoral rules and how they make a difference. So let me make an obvious point, but as I say to my students, sometimes the obvious points are right, so we should make them, which is that some electoral systems, it's much harder to break through. I was talking to my students today about new parties, and we were comparing Spain with the UK, and it's very difficult for new parties to break through in the UK because of the electoral system that we have. It's much easier in an electoral system that they have in Spain, for example. So electoral systems indeed can make a difference, but I think it's also important to go beyond just thinking about the typical kind of divisions between proportional and plurality systems, and to also look at the complexities. So there's plenty of research that's been done that looks at, for example, party regulation and party financing arrangements that mean that even within proportional representation systems, it's not just about proportional representation, it's about the whole swathe of laws and regulations that go along with it. And having said that, I was going to be very short. I took my time, so I'm sorry for that, but I'll pass back over to Kevin.
Well, thank you, Tim. I think you, as usual, kind of said what needed to be said. I would add just two small things. One is that when we look at the role of a charismatic leader, and in particular, the second question is what are the characteristics of a particular party leader? You know, I think the single characteristic of a party leader that is most correlated with long-term party success is that leader's willingness to not be the leader anymore at some point. We have an example from the country of Slovakia where we spent a lot of our time initially, where the leader said, there's no glue keeping me in the chair of this party. But in fact, he stayed, and he stayed long past his expiration date, and the party died with him. And we see that consistently. And so, I mean, what we tend to see are now really sort of two kinds of new parties. One is a party that sort of rises and falls very quickly. And it rises because of its charismatic leader and new message. And then the charismatic leader proves to not have the characteristics he promised, or the party's message becomes diluted by the fact that the party is corrupt, and it falls back. But there are some other parties, and one of them is the party called GERB in Bulgaria. Another is a party called Smer in Slovakia, where new parties have emerged and have stuck around. But even in those parties, we see the leaders unwilling to leave the party. And in both of those parties, we see a sinking of the party from absolute first place, well above any of the others, to second, third, sometimes fourth place. The parties experience a decline over time as the leaders' appeal becomes old. And even though they can shore up their support with better ideology, more sustainable ideology, and with organization, the leader becomes more of a weight than a lift. And so we tend to see parties, even in that case, not surviving past a generation. The other question on electoral rules, I think Tim is absolutely right about, you know, the core difference really is the difference between proportional and plurality systems, winner-take-all systems. It is much harder to form new parties in winner-take-all systems. There is this interesting kind of intermediate case, obviously quite common in Latin America, but also in some places in Africa and Asia, where you have a presidential system by nature, a winner-take-all, and then a proportional parliamentary election system. So, you know, there is a kind of mixed space. It is interesting that we found that one system that stabilized most quickly, where there were the fewest new parties in the region that we studied, was Hungary, which has a mixed first past the post and plurality system, where the first past the post is more dominant. But Lithuania, which has a relatively similar system, actually is just as volatile as most of the other countries in its sub-region. So it doesn't seem to have affected Lithuania in that we still get a lot of new parties in that particular realm. And we found a number of places where the electoral rules were more difficult than others. So when we did our field work, Romania was a place where it was actually hard administratively to found a new party. But lo and behold, we did our research there in 2013, and Romanians said, well, what you're finding in other countries will never happen here. But by 2021, Romania had just as many new parties as the other countries, similar places in the region, because political entrepreneurs found ways to work around the difficulty. So that it seems like the impetus, the underlying structural factors that give advantages to new parties are so strong that entrepreneurs will work around it in order to make that happen. So that's all. And the only other thing I wanted to say to Victor, thank you very much. It is really humbling for someone to read what you've written and give it such careful thought, more careful thought than in some ways we may have given some of these things ourselves. And so I really, I look forward to a long dialogue on this. I liked your division, which we didn't make, but you added on about the kind of inter-country, inter-regional, and international effects. That's a really nice formulation of what we were trying to say, but maybe didn't say as well. And I really think, I think maybe one place where we can go further on this, and I can see that it's true in the Mexican case as well, is the need to study these new parties across multiple cycles, to look at them longitudinally. They're interesting in and of themselves, but what's most interesting is how they relate from one to the next to the next. And so that was what the 30-year time period allowed us to do. And what we're finding is that once started, these cycles are very difficult to damp down. And so we get a series of parties that look a little bit like the previous parties, but aren't the same. And it's really interesting for me, to look at the PRD and then Moreno, and to see a kind of succession of political parties, all of them with their splits and splinters, but each of them slightly different than the preceding one. And the question was, how long does a Moreno survive, right? Once the leader, proves the flaws that the leader has, does it become an institutionalized question? The interesting thing that we found is that there tend to be two kinds of parties. There tend to be the older parties that endure, so the PRI stays an important part because it has that deep organization and it stands for something and so on. New parties come, but they rarely stay. And so we get the old parties, like in the Bulgarian example, the Bulgarian socialists stick around, the Bulgarian ethnic parties, the Turkish ethnic parties stick around, and then a succession of new parties. So there's always a couple of old ones that have been around forever, and some new ones that have been around for 1, 2, 3 election cycles, but don't last very long. So I agree completely, and it's something I hope we can work on together.
Well, thank you so much. I have the ungrateful task to control the time. So Professor Houghton, if you want to add some, but we have like a couple of minutes. So it's really ungrateful, but where are the events of the Congress?
Don't worry. I mean, I just also wanted mostly to thank Victor, but maybe I'll just throw out one thought to a Mexican audience. So one of the kind of arguments that we find in the book is that once you've had a disruption to the system, it's very difficult to go back to stability before. So for someone who doesn't know much about Mexican politics, but knows that it was very stable for a long period of time with 3 parties, you've had the emergence of Moreno's party. Interesting, where López Obrador came from. The interesting question is, will we see that revert back to a stability, or will we see a continuing newness? In some senses, will you see the kinds of arguments that Kevin and I make replicated in Mexico or not? And that would actually create a really exciting research project between Central Europeanists and Mexican scholars.
Thank you so much, Professor. Well, I also apologize with Enrique Trejo, Amber Luna, who makes more questions, but we will try to
the questions,
send to...
we will answer them in writing.
Okay, perfect. I think that's the best way to attend these questions of the audience. And I'm really honored of this day, and thank you so much to staying here. Also, to the authors, to Professor Miron, Professor Alarcón. We are going to pass the channel to the following event of the Congress. So, and we have to end this presentation, and I will pass to make the final message in Spanish. Agradeciendo a todos los que están aquí con nosotros las preguntas de de Enrique Trejo y Amber Luna. Por razones de tiempo no las alcanzamos a atender, pero las vamos a enviar a los autores para que de alguna manera las puedan responder por escrito. Hay otros eventos que siguen en el Congreso y por lo tanto tenemos que concluir esa sesión. Los agradecemos a todos, tanto los asistentes que participaron a esa presentación como los que estuvieron viéndonos desde YouTube. Los invito a que sigan también las demás presentaciones, eventos del Congreso de SOME y por mi parte, pues los mejores deseos y nos vemos pronto. Cuídense mucho.